Hi everybody and welcome. Today we're going to be talking about trigonometric identities. So this is just kind of a fancy way to show you some shortcuts, we'll say, for when we're solving problems that use trig. So that's like sine, cosine, tangent, all of those things. There are some tricks for simplifying these. So first things first, a trig identity is an equation that is true for all values of an equation. And there are some things that are going to look really familiar here, but actually mean something a little bit different. And we'll go through an example of how we kind of arrived at each of these things using a little bit of fraction math first. And then I'll just list off some other ones. And you're welcome to go through the proofs if you ever want to see how we get to these things. So here's an example of a trig identity. We know that tangent of an angle is the opposite over the adjacent. We know that sine is the opposite over the hypotenuse, and we know that cosine is the adjacent over the hypotenuse. So here's a trick. If we do sine divided by cosine, we can actually turn this into some fraction math. So for those of you that were like, Fraction Friday, what are we using this for? Well, we're about to use it right now. So opposite over hypotenuse on top, and then cosine on the bottom, is adjacent over hypotenuse. Well, this in the middle, this fraction bar, we can also view that as division. So we can see this as sine of x divided by cosine of x. Or alternatively, we can see this as opposite over hypotenuse divided by adjacent over hypotenuse. So again, up until this point, there's nothing new that we're doing. We're just doing an example problem. We're dividing sine by cosine and seeing what that gets us. So let's do that fraction math. Let's keep, change, and flip. And what we're going to see here is we'll have O times H on the top, and we'll have A times H on the bottom. And if you have an H on the top and the bottom, it simplifies to 1. So it actually just equals opposite over adjacent. So if we divide sine by cosine, that equals opposite over adjacent. Well, what else equals opposite over adjacent? Tangent. Tangent is also equal to opposite over adjacent. So we actually just discovered a trig identity. So this is just a really fancy way of saying tangent of an angle is equal to the sine of that angle over the cosine of that angle. So there's trig identity number 1. And that's something that you're going to want to write down, memorize, basically use that in a chart, because we're about to use that a whole lot. And there's a lot of these. So we're going to go through them. A lot of them aren't nearly as bad as basically how we got to that first one. So for example, number 2, cotangent also has a trig identity. And cotangent is tangent flipped upside down. So cotangent is tangent flipped upside down. So that's your second one. And we'll keep going with these. So again, I would say use this as a list. Store this list somewhere in your notes. We're going to be replacing things with it. There's nothing too crazy here. Sine is cosine flipped. So that's what we're doing here for number 3. Number 4, again, extremely similar. Sine is cosecant flipped. I said the wrong thing. Cosecant is sine flipped upside down. So again, hopefully that should logically follow how we're kind of getting to that point. Same thing here for cosine. Cosine is secant flipped, and then secant is also cosine flipped. And then the last two, tangent, another identity for it is just cotangent flipped. And then cotangent, we see that as tangent flipped. So there are some things that will always be true that you'll always be able to kind of replace as you're going through. So 8 identities of the basics of our trig functions. So these are the first set. And there is a second set. There's some equations that also hold true. So identity number 9 is if we have sine squared of an angle and we add it to cosine squared of the same angle, it's always going to equal 1. Number 10, tangent squared plus 1 of an angle is equal to the secant squared of that same angle. And then our final identity here is the cotangent of an angle plus 1 is equal to the cosecant squared of an angle. Now at this point, looking at 11 new things, you're probably feeling a little bit overwhelmed. And what I'll say here is just write these down in your notes. There's no magic thing that I did in my head to make these appear on the paper. These are things that were given to me from the textbook, and just write them down in your notes. Memorize them if you want to memorize them, but there's nothing crazy about these. It's just something to reference in your notes. So make sure you do have access to these 11 things, especially with an assessment coming up. You don't want to have to memorize them. But these are just some identities, some things that are true. So on the first day that we did trigonometry, I told you SOHCAHTOA is true. Sine is opposite over hypotenuse. This is the same kind of deal with different things. So we're just finding out some new things, some additional things that are true, and we're just committing them in our notes. That way we have them for reference. So what do we use these things for? Well, let's go over an example. You'll get something like this. It'll say simplify, and it'll give you like a multiplication or an addition problem. So simplify tangent times cosine. That's something that you'll be given. You'll have to basically take this and make it smaller, simplify it, do something with it. So there's no magic trick to this. We just go back up in our notes, we find tangent. Say, okay, I think that was identity number 1. If we take a look at this here, we'll see that tangent is sine over cosine. So if we go back down, we can substitute that in its place. Instead of tangent, let's do the sine of x over cosine of x. And if we keep cosine, just make it a fraction over 1, what we're going to see is we'll get sine times cosine on top, and we'll just get cosine on the bottom. When we do this, we have the same thing on the top and the bottom. So those divide to equal 1, or they simplify to 1, and we'll just be left with the sine of x. So basically when we're working with our trig identities, we're replacing something that we're given in a way that helps us basically cancel or reduce something out to get less trig functions. So this is actually a win here because we're dealing with less. If you start off with 2 things, tangent and cosine, you actually only need the sine. So that helps us. I know this is confusing, so we'll do a few example problems today. For our next one, we'll try a little bit more fractions. We'll get something like simplify sine times cosecant, all divided by cotangent. So my advice when you're working through these is just take it one step at a time if it seems overwhelming. Maybe just start with the top. So if we're just starting with the top, let's keep sine as it was. So this sine right here, we're keeping that as it was. If we look back up at our notes, looking for cosecant, cosecant is 1 over sine. Okay, so going back down here, cosecant is 1 over sine, so we'll keep that as 1 over sine. Then on the bottom here, we'll leave this as cotangent. Okay, so let's keep going. On the top, sine times 1 is sine. Bottom, sine times 1 is sine, and then still keeping cotangent there. When we do this, sine divided by sine, anything divided by itself is still just 1. So we're going to have 1 over the cotangent of x. Well, if you're thinking that looks familiar, it's because it should be. 1 over cotangent of x. Let's look back at our notes. 1 over the cotangent of x is just equal to the tangent of x. It's a little bit of a matching game here once we get to this point. So let's go back down. 1 over the cotangent of x is just equal to the tangent of x. And that's actually going to be our final answer. So we took this tricky question with multiple things on top and a fraction and what looked like we'd have to do a whole lot of work. And we actually just did one simplifying step and we found ourselves at an identity. And again, I know this is challenging, so let's keep going. Let's do another example question. So again, simplify. And this time we're going to have cosine of x times the tangent of x, both of those things squared, plus cosine squared of x. So looking at some PEMDAS here, let's evaluate what's inside of our parentheses first. So looking at this cosine of x, we'll write it as over 1, and then tangent, we know that first identity is sine over cosine. And all of this is squared, and we still have to bring over that cosine squared of x. So if we do this, we'll have cosine of x times the sine of x, all divided by cosine of x. And again, still bringing over plus cosine of x. Cosine on the top and bottom simplifies to 1, so we're just left with sine of x all squared plus cosine of x all squared. So before we even get into anything else, let's again take a look at our identities, see if we found anything. Sine squared plus cosine squared. Well, look what we have here. Sine squared plus cosine squared. It actually just equals 1. So go back down here. Sine squared plus cosine squared equals 1. And we're done. That's our answer. So today, while it kind of is like, I would say, hiding behind trig, it's just a bunch of substitution. We're really not using calculators for anything. It's really didn't even draw a triangle in this video, right? So there's nothing crazy about that. We're really just doing a lot of substitution and algebraic manipulation to try to simplify things. So I would say really, really hold that page of notes close with all those identities. And if you do that, you're going to be in really good shape for today. As always, question, shout them out. We're here to help. And let's get started on those questions.